Thank you very much, guys. Thank you, Limo, for inviting me here. I just attended another academic conference a few months ago, and I heard two professors speak, and one of the professors told the other one about his forthcoming book with Oxford University Press, and that he's going to get a huge grant from the EU, and that he has new two doctoral students, and that he's going to be a visiting professor at Harvard University. And after speaking for about 50 minutes, then he said, okay, enough about me, let's talk about you. Did you read my recent article? So I'm going to present actually my recent article, co-authored with an LLM student now in Colombia, Karim. And this article deals with what we call revolutionary lawyering. In other words, the role of lawyers during revolutionary times. Now, you probably are all familiar with this Shakespearean quote, right? The first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. And this is a very known joke on lawyers, on how the people want to get rid of lawyers, how the ordinary people are suspicious regarding lawyers. But if you read this quotation in its original context, so what you realize is that Dick the Butcher, when he said that, he said it because he realized that lawyers are the ones that might stand in front of a revolution. So what Shakespeare is trying to tell us here, that lawyers could be that group that stand just before a certain mob or anarchist, right, to protect the legal system and the legal order. So, just to give you an example for this image of lawyers, I want to show you some photos of Pakistani lawyers demonstrating in 2007 when President Musharraf wanted to suspend the constitution. So Pakistani lawyers were the only ones among the elite groups of Pakistan that went out to the streets against this decision. And you can see here the photos. In these photos where you see lawyers getting beat up by police forces and going out to the streets, standing to preserve the constitution and the legal order, these photos reminded people all around the world what lawyers can do and perhaps should do during revolutions. And in reaction to these protests, the American Bar Association awarded its 2008 Rule of Law Award to those, and I quote, to those lawyers and judges in Pakistan that exhibited courage when defending the rule of law in their country. Right? So we have here an image of lawyers going out to the streets in order to protect the legal system and preserve the constitution against the government. Now, as you can already understand, this presentation is quite different from the ones you heard and will hear today, because I'm not dealing with the legal profession in ordinary times, right? What lawyers do in their everyday life. I'm interested in the social responsibilities or ethical duties that are imposed upon lawyers during these extreme conditions of revolution. Now, just to give you the structure and argument in a nutshell. In the first part, I'll introduce the more traditional image of lawyers, the conservative lawyers, right? When we think of lawyers, we have this image of this conservative profession that wants to maintain the status quo, to preserve the status quo. So this is the traditional image of lawyers, and I will exemplify this through the lack of presence of lawyers in the Israeli mass demonstrations of the social protest that took place in Israel in 2011. So this is the first part. But in the second part, I want to introduce or to present a new image of lawyers, the revolutionary lawyer. And that is the lawyer that wants to go out to the streets and challenges the status quo, right? And you can see here a lawyer in one demonstration, not something that you ordinarily imagine lawyers do. And in the final and third part, what I want to do is just talk about some of the theoretical ideas behind this new image. I mean, what are the duties that are imposed upon lawyers during revolutions? Now, before I start, I think I should just make a brief note what I mean by revolution. So, we all know, maybe not all of us, but there's a famous story from the French Revolution about Louis XVI. He said, that when he heard about the raid of the Bastille, he said, "But good God, that is a revolt." And to which the Duke de Liancourt replied, "No, sir, c'est la révolution." As if to reply that the revolution is something of a force of nature. It's not just the military doing a coup, it's something with force majeure. So what is a revolution is obviously beyond the scope of my presentation. There isn't any uniform decision for what is a revolution. Yes, we all know that this didn't end well for King Louis. My term, or the way I use revolution, is quite broadly. I don't take Kelsen's positivist approach that the revolution is transforming the constitution not according to the amendment procedure. This is I don't accept this because I think the revolutionary changes can take place even through the constitutional amendment procedure. I also don't accept Arendt's approach that revolution has to be accompanied by violence. So for this presentation or this article, we use Ulrich Preuß's definition that revolution or revolutionary change is a change that collapses the existing order or its underlying basic principles and replaces them with new ones. So as you can see, this is a very broad definition that could include both constitutional revolutions that want to change the government, but also social revolutions, right? They want to change, could be the ownership of property, etc. As long as they do it fundamentally, right? Completely replace it. Another thing to bear in mind is the distinction between a reform and a revolution, right? A reform derives from the Latin word reformare. Reformare means changing an existing thing, but the thing remains, it's the same thing. So basically there's a difference between a reform and a revolution. Every revolution requires certain reforms, but not every reform is a revolutionary one. Alright, so this is just to put things in context. Now, what is unique about revolutionary lawyering, or what I want to present, is not only the intensity of the change that we're aiming to do, but the extra legal means to achieve this change. So when we talk about lawyers and social movements and social change, we usually talk about litigation, legislation, etc. This is not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in joining and often even leading mass popular street protests. Right? So you go and you search for extra legal means to achieve that change. And Robert Gordon referred to what I showed you, those Pakistani lawyers, and I quote a nice paragraph. He said, "Anyone who watched the pictures of Pakistani lawyers in their dark business suits and ties, out on the streets in the thousands to protest, knew he was seeing something way out of the ordinary. We do not usually associate lawyers with street protests." But what I want to claim is that this is precisely what's going on now around the globe. You see many lawyers trying to achieve social changes precisely where you don't expect them, in the streets. All right? So this is like the main argument. Now, let's begin with a conservative image of lawyers. So we usually associate the legal profession as a conservative, right? We consider the lawyers as an elite group that wants to guard the status quo. Now, I want to suggest a few other reasons why we usually associate lawyers with conservatism. So first, the legal education stresses respect for the legal and governmental institutions, right? And settling conflicts through peaceful legal procedures. What lawyers do, submitting petitions, drafting letters, lobbying, all these are legitimate means, but they're all confined within a certain framework, right? The second thing is that lawyers, they play an institutional role, or at least a quasi-institutional role. They are officers of the court. As officers of the court, as the long arm of the rule of law, lawyers have the kind of feeling of limitations, right? They can't do whatever they want. They are part of the rule of law. And this is very different from the somewhat anarchistic characteristics that are expressed in revolutions and protests. The third main thing, I think, is that a lawyer, in his ordinary work, plays a role that is not necessarily radically judgmental. What lawyers do? We have a client, we step into his shoes, and we need to represent his interests the best way we can. This does not leave us too many options, or doesn't leave us any space to think radically. There's simply no need. On the contrary, we need to compromise. If this is for the best interest of the client, then we need to compromise. All right? I've read some researchers that show that the cognitive orientation of lawyers, and this is interesting, is such that they receive differently than other major groups, and in a decisive manner, they receive or accept the social legal order as it is. This is very interesting. And this relates to this conservative image, right? And finally, especially in common law countries, lawyers, the way they think, they have a cognitive way of thinking that is a syllogistic way of thinking, right? Syllogism in logic means that we have a primary assumption, a secondary assumption, and then a conclusion. If I'm a lawyer, to take it in a very abstract way, let's say we know that murder is killing of a human being intentionally. So this is the primary assumption, the first rule. And I have a client, I will try to prove, let's say that he didn't kill that person intentionally. And that is the second assumption. If in the second assumption he didn't kill him, he killed that person but not intentionally, then the conclusion is that he haven't committed any murder, right? But this way of thinking, this syllogistic way of thinking, doesn't leave us much space to question the original rules. When a client comes to us, we look for the legal rule that applies and try to see how the facts apply to the matter. We don't question the legal rules at the first stage. All right. So, in all of these, we can't expect lawyers to be the spearhead in social change movements. Now, if I can just say another word of that. Yeah, I want to say a word about the study sizes. The precedent. In the common law countries, we work according to binding precedents, right? So it's very easy to look for a precedent that applies to our case or not, right? And the way the common law works and precedents work, it goes stage by stage, slowly, right? Gradually. This is very different from the drastic and quick changes that social movements try to achieve. All right. So, already in 1835, Tocqueville said that people that had dedicated themselves to the study of law derived certain habits of order and a liking of formality from the legal profession, which naturally make them hostile to any revolutionary spirit. And more recently, William Quigley wrote that in order to become a revolutionary lawyer, a person must forget most of what he has learned in law schools. And we can understand why. Right? So, to put all this together, the idea of revolutionary lawyering seems kind of a paradox or an oxymoron, right? Because we don't conceive them as a type of group that would want to undermine the status quo, to completely change. And I want to give an example for this image of lawyers in the recent protests in Israel in 2011. So, as most of you probably know, in 2011, there were mass protests in the street, beginning actually in a bunch of tents being established in Rothschild Boulevard against the high cost of living and the housing cost. And this, soon enough, emerged into major popular protests, hundreds of thousands of people going to the street and crying for the people demand social justice. That was the phrase that everyone used. So this was it. And what is interesting for my argument is that lawyers, not just that lawyers were not part of the leading or the leaders of this protest, law itself was silent. We haven't seen lawyers, we haven't seen law firms, we haven't seen the bar. The Israeli bar was silent about what's going on. Law was completely absent from these mass protests. And this is quite weird because, as you just heard before, Israel is a very legalistic society. The highest number of lawyers per capita. And in Tel Aviv, I think it's 1 lawyer to 34 residents. That's insane, right? Wherever you throw a coin, you hit a lawyer. And nonetheless, lawyers were absent from these protests. Now, it's not to say that lawyers weren't part of the protesters. Of course, there were lawyers, but not as lawyers, but as private individuals, and I'll get to that later on. So law was absent, completely absent. So this is, you can say, okay, this fits to this traditional conservative image of lawyers. Why would lawyers try to join the social protest? Well, there are actually some researchers in Israel that tried to see why law was absent. And they interviewed the people involved in these protests. And what they said, well, they either thought that law was irrelevant or could just undermine the causes of the protests. And others thought that law serves for the hegemony of the high elite and simply perpetuates the socioeconomic situation. So there's no need to go to any legal arguments. But the fact is that lawyers were absent from this entire debate. Now, in a second, I'll show you the different pictures of the Arab Spring, and I'll start now by saying, obviously, the Israeli protest of 2011 is very different from those revolutions that were going on in the Arab countries, and the demands were different, and I'll get back to that soon enough. But just to say that we can't ignore the relations between the two. In all of these cases, in all of these social protests that took place all around the world, actually, they all began from popular mass demonstrations, going out to the street, creating a Habermasian space for deliberation and critical thinking, and they all came out from this. So at least in that respect, and in the timing of all these protests, there are quite a lot of similarities. So this is just to finalize the first part of the conservative image of lawyers. Now I want to go and show you the other image, that of the Arab Spring. And I'll give you a brief few sentences on every revolution. So the Tunisian Revolution, I've gathered some photos of lawyers demonstrating in the streets, right? These are all lawyers, yeah? So first in Tunisia was the first country where the Arab Spring actually emerged. Lawyers were actually the first to go out on the street in an organized manner. They first began as a general strike, and later they took part in every protest. But what is interesting, and this is a recurring theme, is that those lawyers going out to the protest did not do that as ordinary citizens. They did that as lawyers. They got dressed with their suits, with their black robes or gowns, yeah, and they went out to the streets as lawyers. And this is, I think, very important, and I'll elaborate on that later on. From what I've read, the presence of these lawyers, dressed as lawyers, stimulated the people and maybe somehow deterred the police from using force. And the Tunisian bar gave official statements supporting the people in their struggle against the government. Right? This is important. So this is the Tunisian case. So you can say, all right, this guy, he found some pictures of Tunisia, that's very nice. It's not only in Tunisia. Now Libya, all right? We all know the Libyan revolution and Gaddafi's end of rule. And in Libya, lawyers were the first, again, to protest and to go out to the street. It actually became as a small protest of lawyers as a result of the arrest of a human rights activist and a lawyer, Fathi Terbil. And it was the violent reaction of the police to that protest that actually sparked the enormous uprising that eventually led to a civil war in Libya. So again, lawyers were the first to initiate these social protests. Not through litigation, not through lobbying or whatever, they went out to the street. I gave you a quote from The Guardian. One lawyer from Benghazi said, "We started just as lawyers looking for our rights, and now we are revolutionaries, right? Revolutionary lawyers. And we don't know how to manage. We want to have our own fate." I think it should be fate. "For 42 years we have this kind of barbarianism. We now want to live." All right? So this is the story in Libya. And perhaps the most famous demonstration was actually the Egyptian revolution, right? This was the most covered by the media and maybe the most memorable. Also here, this is Tahrir Square. The riots in Egypt began in a Facebook communication between lawyers. Lawyers wrote between them on Facebook that they should hold a demonstration, a peaceful demonstration, but eventually this led to bigger demonstrations. And on February 9th, 2012, more than 3,000 lawyers marched toward Tahrir. And again, as you can see, wearing their black gowns, right? And assisting the revolution. Another interesting fact, on top of the building of the syndicate, of the Egyptian bar, there was a sign that stated the following: "The Egyptian lawyers support the demands of the free Egyptian young generation." Right? That was on top of the building of the syndicate, the Egyptian syndicate. And the final example I want to give you is from Turkey. So Turkey wasn't really part of the Arab Spring, but still, this is a very interesting case. So in May 2013, after President Erdogan wanted to destroy a big park, Gezi Park, and build some new buildings on that park, and there was a very quiet sit-in, like a sit-in demonstration, people coming and sitting in this park to protest against this decision. And then the police violently took those protesters out, and in response, lawyers came into the main court, the High Court in Istanbul, protesting against this police brutality and human rights violation. In reaction, the police took those lawyers out forcefully, right? And you can see here pictures of police officers taking lawyers out of the court, and 50 lawyers were arrested. As a result of this arrest, where was that? Yeah, consequently, 3,000 lawyers again protested just in front of the court. A few days later, you can see here this mass protest of lawyers. And here you can see it's funny because, it's not funny, but the police are taking the lawyer, and this is just in front of the covered eyes of Justicia, right? The statue of Justicia. She doesn't see what's going on, and they just take away the lawyers forcefully. All right, so this is the final example. So what we have here in all these photos is an image of a new model of a lawyer, a revolutionary lawyer, that goes against the government, that goes out to the streets, tries to use extra legal means in order to bring about a social change. And I think that this is very interesting. Now, how can we explain this phenomenon of revolutionary lawyering? So I think there are three approaches. There are three main approaches. I'll go back later to the other. The first one is what I call frustration that motivates political mobility. And this is taken from Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America. He says, "In a state of society in which the members of the legal profession cannot hold a rank in the political world, which they enjoy in private life, we may rest assured that they will be the foremost agents of revolution." So what Tocqueville is actually saying, he's saying lawyers are talented people, but they're frustrated. So they would go out on the streets. And quite recently, Paul Mason, relating to the Arab Spring, said, "A social structure can hurt and disappoint the poor for many generations, but when lawyers sit hungry and frozen in attics, then the revolution will begin." All right? So this is one approach, the one I call frustration approach. The second approach might be the skeptical or realpolitik one. And according to this one, people are saying, well, what do you want? Lawyers, they're a self-interest group. They see where the revolutionary wind blows, and then they just join and often lead the revolution because they know it's good for them. So this is the skeptical approach. And the third approach, which I'll elaborate in the final part, is that perhaps lawyers have a special role in society, especially in relation to fundamental rights and freedoms. But before that, let me just go. I want to say a word. I showed you why lawyers are usually conceived as conservative. Now I want to show you why lawyers may be useful for revolutions. So first, they're educated, right? They know how to analyze scenarios and to propose solutions. Second, they know the legal material. They know their country laws. They often do comparative law, so they know what's going on in other states. In that way, they can tell when the current rules don't help to promote their society or what can be done better. And accordingly, they can supply legal justifications for support of the revolutionary call. They have representative and rhetorical skills, as we all know. And they have, again, speech and organizational abilities that could make them useful for social movements and in revolutions. All right, so this is the other side of the mirror. And here we arrive to the third and final part, and that's the more perhaps theoretical debate. So we have this idea of lawyers taking part in revolutions. Does this raise any questions regarding their ethical duties? Or, let's say, social responsibilities? The first question, I think, is, well, what do you want from us? Why to deal with ethical or social duties in the first place? What does that have to do with anything? And I think, well, there is an institutional interest when lawyers actually involve the dignity of the profession, right? And especially, as we know, when lawyers participate in extra professional activities, there's a general duty not to suggest that they act in their legal capacities. But again, remember the photos. In all of these photos, those lawyers protesting on the streets were doing it as lawyers, or at least showing the people that they're doing it as capacity as lawyers, coming with their suits, etc. So I think there is a question of legal of ethics, and if not of professional ethics, then at least the social responsibilities. And what I want to argue in the paper actually is that revolutionary times create complicated dilemmas for lawyers. Of course, it can't be an easy answer, it has to be complicated. So, on the one hand, I want to claim, as we know, lawyers have a duty to protect the legal order and to preserve the rule of law and the legal system. To give an example for that, just look at the preamble of the American Bar Model of Rules of Professional Conduct. A lawyer's conduct should conform to the requirements of the law, we all know that. A lawyer should demonstrate respect for the legal system and for those who serve it. Lawyers play a vital role in the preservation of society. So we have this image of preservation, obeying the law, etc. But the very idea of revolution is that the existing legal order might collapse, right? This is just the counter thing. Therefore, I think the duty of preserving the legal order might be involved in anti-revolutionary behavior. You can say that if there's a revolution, lawyers, because of their duty to preserve the legal order and preserve the legal system, should object to revolutions, to be counter-revolutionaries. And I think if we go back to Pakistan, some may claim that when we saw, it is true that these Pakistani lawyers, they went out to the streets, but what they did, they didn't want to promote democracy. They wanted to preserve the rule of law, to protect the existing constitutional order, right? Likewise, just 2 months ago, in response to a certain white paper issued by mainland China, almost 2,000 lawyers went out to the street in a peaceful protest against what they thought is a challenge to judicial independence. So those lawyers wanted to protect the rule of law, to go against new initiative that might undermine the rule of law in its broad understanding. So this is on the one side. But on the other hand, I think that lawyers have a social responsibility to improve the legal system, not only to preserve it, but also to improve it. Again, from the same preamble, as a public citizen, a lawyer should seek improvement of the law, access to the legal system, the administration of justice, and the quality of service rendered by the legal profession. Right? So the lawyer should seek improvement of the law. So usually, as you all know, this responsibility will be materialized through legal ways. They can bring cases to test, right? They can bring cases to court. They can try to change legislation, etc. But the ability to improve the law in these confined means is quite limited. We can make drastic changes. We cannot make revolutionary changes in such ways. And this is one of the arguments Limor quite often makes, and we heard that before. So we know that lawyers have a special social responsibility. Lawyers should use their knowledge and ability for the good of the society, right? We give the legal profession a monopoly and independence, and in return, they should act in the favor of the society. So all this means that they should act, to improve the legal system. Another argument that one can make is that there's a difference between formal understanding of the rule of law and substantive understanding of the rule of law. So even if we take the previous argument that lawyers should protect the rule of law, if we're merely talking about a formal understanding of the rule of law, let's say obeying the law, right, then obviously they should object revolutions. But if we talk about the rule of law in its substantive sense, as equal treatment, as certain basic fundamental rights, then in certain revolutions, in order to protect the rule of law in its substantive sense, lawyers should join the revolution and encourage the revolution, especially in democratic revolutions. Now, what is a democratic revolution? This is a tough question. We define democratic revolutions as a revolution whose goal is to weaken suppression and tyranny forces and to promote liberal and democratic rights and liberties. Now, this is quite vague because you never know what will be the outcomes. Everyone that leads revolutions says, I'm taking us to a better place. You never know the outcome. The outcome, you only know if a certain revolution is truly democratic ex post facto. You never know it ex ante, right? You never know that before that. You can say very nice words, and then once you're in power, to have a totalitarian regime. But you understand the main idea of my argument. So democratic revolutions, they bring greater awareness of fundamental rights and values, which in part demand an independent legal profession that is willing to act as a power in between the people and the government. And we know that historically, lawyers have served as guardians of liberties and freedoms in democratic societies. So basically, the core of the argument here is that democratic revolution might undermine the duty of lawyers to preserve the legal order, which did not abide by the substantive understanding of the rule of law. And I have here a nice quote from David Luban, who says, "There's no reason for a lawyer to display respect for the law unless the law deserves that respect." And we know the history of the Nazi Germany and of Vichy government in France, where lawyers and jurists abide by the rules, happily apply them. And more recently, perhaps we know of those South African judges applying and enforcing the apartheid. And actually, David Eisenhower, in his book Judging the Judges, criticizes the legal profession in South Africa for not doing something to fight for the substantive understanding of the rule of law. Now, I know these are all tough questions, but what to do? Should the judges leave their positions, or should they try to act to improve the system from within their own capacity? These are all tough questions, but this is the main argument. I want to finish with two things. First, I'm sorry for the long quote, but I think it's nice. William Quigley recently wrote, "There are enough lawyers in this world defending the way things are. Plenty of lawyers protect unjust people and institutions in our social, economic, and political systems. Plenty of lawyers work for structures that perpetuate and increase the racism, militarism, and materialism in our world. These lawyers are plentiful and well compensated. True structural and fundamental change will not come by aiming at small revisions or reforms. Remember the distinction I made between revolution and reforms. If we're going to transform our world, we need lawyers willing to work with others towards a radical revolution of our world. We need no more lawyers defending the status quo. We need revolutionaries. And this is what I try to portray here, an image of revolutionary lawyers. And perhaps the most important point that I want to make is that a lawyer is not like other citizen. And the legal profession is different from any other profession. That is because the general public conceives lawyers as experts on acting within the boundaries of the existing legal institutions. If they step out of this capacity, if lawyers themselves seek social change in extra-legal ways, their acts have a direct and tremendous influence on the legitimacy of the legal institutions and the rule of law, and may determine the legitimacy of the revolution itself. Just go back to Tahrir Square and those lawyers in their black robes and suits. What a great influence on the legitimacy of the revolutionary call. That's it. Thank you very much.
We have 10 minutes for questions.
Perfect.
Yes.
There's one thing I didn't quite understand. You brought examples from the Israeli social protests, and you brought examples from the American Bar Association rules, and yet clearly when you talk about revolution, you're not talking about revolution in democratic societies where the law potentially has the capacity to change. You're talking about those reform. I mean, in Israel and in the U.S., anything you're talking about is going to be reform, I assume, unless you're talking about something which much beyond anything which we're thinking about. Those things that happen in the Arab countries, what happened in China, in Hong Kong, that's perfectly understandable. There are no recourse to the courts. You have no choice but to go out to the streets to revolt, a revolution.
In Hong Kong?
Where?
In Hong Kong?
In China, when
no, these were protests in Hong Kong.
Right, against telling China was doing to them. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, to sue the Chinese government, the Chinese court. I assume you're not going to get very far. So why? I mean, in Israel and the U.S., maybe lawyers should be a catalyst for reform, possibly, but certainly not for revolution. I don't see anybody saying that in Israel or the U.S. we're talking about that kind of revolution that lawyers should be. So why bring them in as a comparison? Why not talk about totalitarian countries and the function of lawyers in totalitarian countries?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, first, obviously, once you already have an established democracy that respects fundamental rights, then you say, well, then you don't need revolutionary lawyers. But even if you go back to Israel and the social protests, this was not mere reforms. The entire debate was that of a revolution. I want to go back, if I can go back. That was quite in the beginning. Here it is. So, all right. So it started as a protest against the high living costs, but then it got to debate the power and economic structures of the state and people. That the language spoken was that of a revolution. And I intentionally brought here a sign that says, Egypt is here, right? Because it's not, we don't want minor reforms. We want a revolution. We want a complete change of the social economic order in Israel. And the language was that of revolution. Now, what if I would say that the people in the Israeli streets were not looking only for some minor economic benefits, but for a new constitution, a full new constitution that would acknowledge economic and social rights? Would that be revolutionary? I think yes. I think it would be. And I think there was a place for that. But for some reason, it was absent. People weren't talking about it. And that was the place for it. And in a society like Israel, where every day people are running to the Supreme Court for something else, you would expect it to have some legal arguments on what's going on. Basic laws on social rights.
Maybe the opposite. Because you can go to the Supreme Court, therefore lawyers don't need to go to the streets. In Tunisia, you can't go to the court, so you have to go to the streets.
It's true, but what is interesting is that Gad Barzilai's research precisely shows that even those lawyers that participated in the protest didn't even conceive that law was relevant. No, they didn't conceive that law was relevant. They didn't think it's relevant. Revolution. Because they thought it's not enough to achieve what the people are doing now on the street. What they thought, the state of mind was, here on the streets, we are much more powerful than we can go in the court. Because the court is confined. What can the court do? The court can do a lot of things, obviously. But the legal changes that could be made through court cannot be as drastic as those mass process. But I agree with your general challenge to these examples. I agree. But even historically, you mentioned the US. So obviously now this is a beautiful democracy. But who led the American Revolution?
There were some lawyers there. John Adams.
There were some lawyers.
John
Look
Adams,
at
Adams was a lawyer.
the Declaration of Independence. More than half of them are lawyers. Who led the French Revolution? Who led the French Revolution? Lawyers.
That was against an autocracy.
Yes.
It wasn't against a democracy.
Of course. But if you have a democracy, you cannot ask for a democracy. But these were lawyers asking to promote fundamental rights and freedoms. The Glorious Revolution, lawyers took it by hand when William, Orange William came. So lawyers can play a major role in promoting fundamental rights, and especially in democratic revolutions. And yeah, but I get the point.
Do you have any examples of in an established democracy of some sort of revolt, reform, movement, whatever, which were led by lawyers?
No, well, actually, so this is just the second project out of hopefully 3. So the first one was more historical, looking at the historical revolutions, the big ones. This one is more contemporary, and hopefully the third one would be perhaps more empirical, really examining the role of lawyers in revolutions more thoroughly, because this paper relies mainly on secondary sources. Literature mainly, but I really hope to look in various in a wide spectrum of social protest in both democratic and non-democratic states, and see what role the lawyers play in these revolutions. That's definitely the aim. Yes.
Do you think that if the revolution goes together with the breach of the law?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. That's why I said I don't accept Kelsen's argument definition of a revolution, because you can make a revolution change even if you use existing laws or procedures. Because for me, what's important is the extent of the change. A change can be revolutionary even if it's done through legal institutions, for example. But it's very hard to achieve revolutionary changes in such ways.
But do you see a difference between participating in a revolution that includes the breach of the law, or the revolution that doesn't include the breach of the law?
This is a breach of law? Here, this lawyer, this young lawyer, throwing a stone or a hand grenade, I have no idea what it is. Obviously it's a breach of law, right? Might hurt someone. It's a violent act, and it's not a peaceful demonstration. He's not just standing there to protest. What he's doing is illegal, prima facie at least. And yet, I would say that this act, illegal act, might be justified, not legal, but might be justified if we're thinking about social responsibilities. And as we know, there's a distinction, a wide difference between legality and legitimacy. So this is just.
But you didn't say, or you didn't think that the Israeli lawyers, the Israel bar, should support the breach of the law in the protest?
No, definitely not. I don't think that they should officially say we should breach the law, but I do expect that if we have hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating on the street regarding their rights being violated or infringed or whatever, I would expect the bar to say something, either in support or not, but they don't necessarily have to encourage people to breach the law or act illegally or in a violent manner. Although, as we've seen in Egypt and other places, that's precisely what the bar has done. But I don't want the bar to be silent. When the issues are issues of the rule of law and fundamental rights, I want the bar to speak.
But you do expect the lawyers in Tunisia, for instance, even to breach the law?
Yes, but even the Declaration of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms from the Universal Declaration acknowledges in its preamble that the people have a natural right to revolt when their rights are not being respected. So yes, if I'm to support fundamental rights, I would call me revolutionary. I would agree with forcible revolutions if they would bring to a better world. I guess so.
So yeah. There is a difference between a revolution in a democratic state and a non-democratic state.
Yeah, precisely. But the question is how much force you need to get in order to achieve what you want, the aims. So if we compare the Israeli revolution, what was it? It was a revolution of spoiled people. I'm saying it brutally, right? Because people saying, oh, there's a very high cost of living, high cost of housing, we want better lives. In the Arab world, they went against totalitarian governments or hybrid governments, if you like, and they were willing to risk their life to fight militaries and police forces in order to achieve fundamental rights, justice, and to fight corruption. So the things on the scale were utterly different, and therefore also the means taken were different. So that's the thing. That's the distinction between the two.
So thank you for the presentation. I have several points. First is to follow up on this distinction between a liberal and illiberal state. So in an illiberal society, you need lawyers to represent the liberal position, right? Because you have some assumption that lawyers represent individualism in a sense, right? They don't represent, right, the society. They present one person versus the society many times. So, and they present or they are attached to values, liberal values. So in those societies, they might be the representative of liberalism, whereas in a liberal society, you don't need the lawyers to represent these values, or they might even be more conservative than the liberal side, which is more revolutionary and so on. So, so this is one difference. There's also a second difference. This pertains to Israel, and the question raised by Barzilai and others: why didn't the lawyer join? What they thought? Why didn't they think this was their responsibility? And this is the democratic aspect, because lawyers go to courts. Courts are not democratic representations of the people. Rather, social movements try to affect politics or try to gain traction within the elections or political movements which reflect democratic will. So in order for a change to be, in a sense, democratic, lawyering is not exactly where you want to go. Also, there's the idea of the limitation of change through law, which law is written about.
Do you conceive mass protest such as this as democratic?
Yes.
Yes.
In Israel.
No, not in Israel.
No,
Generally
that's
generally
the non-liberal side. I'm talking about within a liberal democratic society.
Mhm.
Those protests are the revolutionary is just rhetoric with respect to Israel. Nobody really thought of it a real revolution. They thought about attempts to change within the legal order, and they try to affect government, try to affect maybe the next elections. So that would be a democratic way to affect it, rather than go to find judges that think the way you think, right? And they would impose on government what they think is right. Okay, so that is what lawyers may think. Why it is better to make also change through social movement is more stable, or let's say strong, than change that is somewhat imposed through legal means, right? Because it comes from social movement.
It's more legitimate.
It's more legitimate. It's also more lasting, or more sort of.
That's empirical.
Right, but right. So I don't know. Social facts, the busing thing in the U.S. didn't really work because maybe there wasn't social acceptance, or such types of research about limitation. And finally, just a final point, this idea about legal education that educates you to be subservient or conservative. Legal education today is radical, right? You just look at the U.S., Israel, they're all really radical professors. So,
your argument about the legal education is very much true. We have now a lot of courses in critical legal studies, etc. Yes, but even these clinics or whatever, the ways by which they try to achieve difference, and I'm very much in favor, I'm not to say, but still, it's through litigation, etc. But these are through established institutions that are confined, etc. Not, and I also agree with what you said about the democratic one. And what is interesting, and here I think it's another thing that relates the Arab world, the Arab Spring, to the social protests in Israel and in other places, we have this understanding. When you see 500,000 people going out to the street, there's a sense of an awakening of the pouvoir constituant, of the constituent power of the people. This is the people going out on the street, and because they are the people, they are the sovereign, it's not the government, so it's the people, and they now want to change, they want what they deserve. So, and this is something that was recurring in all of the social protests around the world, not only in the Arab Spring, but also in the Western states, the liberal, the Spain, Greek, etc. Yeah.
One more.
One last.
Okay. One more follow-up question. I take issue also with. I understand that you criticize the Israeli bar for not taking a stand in the protests, and I would definitely take issue with that. When you're dealing with controversial issues, besides the fact that the Israeli protest was, in my opinion, more rhetoric than substance, and nobody knew what they wanted. Besides that, we want better life. That's really great. Lower the cost of housing. Fine, let's do it. It was much more rhetoric than substance. And those things that and everybody has his own opinion what he wanted. But for the bar association, I'll speak for myself as a member of dues-paying member of the bar. I would not want the bar to take any position on controversial subjects. That's not its business. If the Israeli government were to suspend the basic laws and allow arbitrary arrest,
So where do you draw the line?
There's a certain point. You're right. There's a certain point when the government has gone to the point where a revolution is justified, where it is justified to forcibly oppose what the government is doing, like in Pakistan. If the government goes to the point where it's saying we're doing something which a reasonable lawyer would expect would object to it, yeah, the bar should take a position there. But we're talking about issues which every person should take a position. I don't think a lawyer here has any more or less capacity than a doctor or anybody else to make a position on what do you think about the price of housing. Why should why should the bar, who's speaking for me, take a position which is against what I think?
I have two things in reply to that. Well, first, let's say what if now the Knesset would pass a law or something like that would limit access to justice to organizations, right? We're bringing back the persona standi in courts. Only those people that are affected by laws can go to courts. Would that? It's not a revolutionary thing. Would that justify a statement by the bar? I think yes, because I think there's an infringement on the right to access to justice. I agree with you that when there are contentious political issues that are clearly political, then the bar should be silent. But when there are issues that are engaged with the rule of law and fundamental rights, such as the right to education, the right to housing, the right to health, I think they should make some kind of statement. And the second thing is that I completely agree with your complaint that the aims of the revolution of the social protest was unclear. But this is precisely, I think, because law was absent. Because if there were lawyers leading these protests, they could have said, there you go, government, Benjamin Netanyahu, this is our list, 10 demands. We want basic law of social and economical rights. We want so and so. They could have, like they did in all the other classical revolutions of the French and American Revolution, that they took vague claims and they transformed them to issues of rights that the people could have understand. Again, lawyers here or jurists could have taken these very abstract and vague claims and turned them into legal demands, and I think we would only benefit from that. But they weren't there.
I think
but that's just my...
If they had said, for example, let's take some silly issues that rose up, we think we should have education from the age of, free education from the age of 1, and we should therefore raise the VAT by 3% to pay for it, you'd lose 90% of your population like that. It's easy to say, we want education, we want housing. Figure out your order of priorities, and try to get 5,000 people to agree to it. I seriously doubt you're going to find that. And you're probably right. The fact that it was vague meant people could come. Who's against social justice?
Yeah.
Sure. Against raising taxes to pay for this, you're gonna have a tough time.
Yeah.
So sure, the fact that lawyers are absent probably helps the revolution. Revolt.
But let's take sorry, can I take one more? 30 seconds. Yeah. Just imagine this following scenario: major protests in the streets. Israeli police forces are going to the streets and trying to take people by force. Then you would have expected the bar to say something?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
So we just didn't get to that level.
For sure.
Because the government was smart enough not to do anything in response.
because
Thank
it
you
was
very much.
peaceful.
Thank you. We'll just go on to our next speaker. We'll have a break at 4:30.